It is one of Stephen King's most famous stories. You have two timelines. One about children dealing with a interdimensional clown, alien, horrifying being, which is sort of an allegory for childhood trauma. And then on the other side, you have the same children now grown up as adults, reliving this trauma and facing it and overcoming it. It is one of Stephen King's most powerful stories. It's certainly my favorite Stephen King story. But one thing that has never been able to quite capture it is any sort of adaptation. Now, I'm not big on the 90s one. I appreciate it for its more authenticity to the book, and I like It Chapter 1, the 2017 movie, but where it really falls for me is It Chapter 2. And I don't think it's necessarily that movie's fault. Could have been better, for sure. Could have been more faithful to the book. But I think inherently, with the structure of that story, it's almost set up to fail. Same with the 90s one, but this is not going to be a 90s adaptation versus 2000s adaptation. Those videos are all over. This is going to be purely focusing on how can we establish what is wrong inherently with splitting this story up, and how can we fix it with what we already have. So the problem is when you separate the story into two full movies, you really break up the structure of the book. Because if you don't know, in the book, the stories do not go, this is the child half and this is the adult half. They bounce back and forth between the two pretty regularly. Sometimes even mid-sentence, you're going to be bouncing between the adult and the childhood part, because these stories are designed in a way to be interwoven. They're very much reliant on the characters developing at the same time as children as they do as adults. Because you may have noticed when you watch It Chapter 2, a lot of the characters don't really feel like where we left off. Now, I know they were children, so 27 years have passed, they're going to feel different. But a lot of what they learned and what they overcame does not transfer over. Now, the book and the movie does explain this with the fact that the further you go away from dairy, the more you forget. And that works if you're experiencing these two stories at the same time. When we watch the movie, we already know what happens to them as kids. So we expect to have some sort of continuance with this, especially with like Eddie, his reliance on his mother, and then he's sort of in that same sort of state when we find him in It Chapter 2, despite having overcame that in It Chapter 1. That is one of the things that doesn't quite make sense, because as you read the book, you are going through the same character development and the child parts complement the adult parts. Just inherently with the structure of the adult parts being that they forgot what happened as kids, they need to come in and remember and go through town. With It Chapter 1, you don't really rely on any outside story to tell it. The child part is a very standalone part. It could work as just a standalone movie, and it does. It Chapter 1 is, in my opinion, a great horror movie. But It Chapter 2 and the adult part of the book relies on going back to the child part. It Chapter 2 does do this. There are multiple times where we get CGI flashbacks to the children because that's just the way the book is, but they obviously couldn't full send it because they had already made It Chapter 1. These scenes that we're flashing back to aren't really that important, given it was made 2 years later and the kids all grew up. You get this really awkward CGI deepfake, because this was 2019, so it wasn't perfect. It still isn't. So really, the only way I think that it could be done in a theatrical sense or a miniseries is if you keep the structural component of the book and you start with the adults, go back to the children, back to the adults with the children. Everything flows much better, and I can prove it. So recently, with the new TV show coming out, I decided to go back and rewatch both movies. And what I found was It Chapter 1, it holds up really well. It's a terrifying movie. Bill Skarsgård gives an excellent performance. But when I got to Chapter 2, what I found was it doesn't have that same sort of style. It feels like a very generic horror movie, whereas It Chapter 1, sure, it had some jump scares here and there. I think Pennywise's performance really carried, and given most of these child actors were unknowns at the time, they give really good performances. None of them are bad. They're all good to great. So It Chapter 1 holds up, whereas It Chapter 2 is definitely carried by the star names and the fact that the casting is just so on point with getting them looking pretty much identical to their child counterparts. But what I did notice was it just kind of felt like a love letter to the first movie, but the first movie had come out only 2 years prior, and it didn't really hold up that part of the book very well that naturally integrated the child parts because they couldn't, because the movie was already made. So they just say, hey, you remember this? And all these things that are supposed to be parallels just feel like legacy callbacks, you know? It doesn't really feel like it's there for any narrative reason. It feels like it's there for like, hey, you remember this? Within these cracks, there are spots where if you wanted to edit it, it's almost perfectly laid out for you to have that book structure. Now, it's not a completely faithful adaptation, but with many of King's works, going purely from book to screen just doesn't work. If you've read the book, you know there's some weird shit in here. There's some stuff in this book that no one should have ever written, and it definitely should have been published. If you know anything about the book, you know what I'm talking about. So obviously, I don't want a complete one-to-one adaptation of the book. I think, like any good book adaptation, Lord of the Rings in particular, you can change things from the book for the betterment of the movie. And people who are more lenient on that are going to understand, and the movies will be better for it. Lord of the Rings, if you just take it one-to-one from the book to the screen, it's not going to be as good of a movie as what we got. I'm not as concerned with the content of the movie as much as the structure. Upon research into potential fan edits that have already done this, I found that Andy Muschietti, who is the director of both Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, he made an offhand comment like 6 years ago that he wanted to combine the movies into one. So they got me thinking that maybe within the movie already, there's spots where you can do this. From what I found, there definitely is. So let's get into what we can do to fix Chapter 2 and make it a very complete and cohesive movie that serves the book better than the two movies we got. So when you look at it, Chapter 1, it's fine. The kids part of the story does not rely on the adults part of the story. It's very self-contained. So there's almost no issues in it Chapter 1, despite, maybe some scares aren't really that scary. So there's nothing you can really change in it Chapter 1. I think all that's great. Like I said earlier, you're supposed to experience these stories at the same time, and you're supposed to feel the character development from child and adult at the same time because they're reliving their trauma and experiencing the trauma for the first time. So there's no buildup of this dread. We know already what has happened to the kids, and the pacing in Chapter 2 just suffers from these constant flashbacks to something that just isn't really relevant to the story. It's just kind of, here, look at this. So first, we're going to start out just like the book. We're going to follow Georgie, obviously, to the famous storm drain scene, and then that's that. From there, after he gets pulled down, you can cut to black and rise up onto the circus scene, which is the next chapter in the book. Perfectly flows. You get your nice little 27 years later title card. You know exactly what's going on, and you almost get a mirror of this scene with Adrian Mellon. Then from here, Mike sees it. We don't really know who he is, but we'll get introduced to him, and he starts calling up all the losers. Now, from here, we get introduced to the adult versions of those characters first, except for Bill, who we saw in the Georgie scene right at the beginning of the movie. We get all the losers introduced, and then we get to Stanley, and after receiving his call, he obviously goes in the bathtub and does what he does. Since we don't really know what has happened to him as a kid, or at all, or why he's so afraid, it creates this much bigger sense of dread and fear than we already get in the movie, which is still a sad scene, but it's not a fearful scene. It's more just sad because obviously we spent the entire first movie with this kid, so it's sad to see him go. I much prefer the way it's handled in the book and in this potential edit, which is, in horror, the scariest thing is the unknown, the unexplained. Once you start explaining things, the horror gets dumbed down a bit. So in the beginning of these movies, when you don't really know what's going on, the scare factor is up to an 11. It's higher. You don't know what's going to happen next. So with him doing what he does, there is stakes immediately involved for both parts of the story because obviously something traumatic happened to him and he doesn't want to face that again. But the others don't go through with this, so they're going to have to face what he's too afraid to face. We find ourselves at the Chinese restaurant scene. Everybody's having a good time catching up. In the Chapter 2 movie, this is serving as a reintroduction of the characters, but since this is our quote-unquote first time seeing them, it serves as an excellent introduction to each of their personalities and their interactions in the group. We can really find what these characters are like and easily pinpoint their personalities. So later, whenever we flash back to kid scenes, we can draw the lines on who's who. And probably the scariest scene for me in it Chapter 2, they're all talking around the dinner table, and then Beverly remembers Pennywise.
Pennywise. Oh, the fucking clown.
Just the sudden dread that comes over the room just by uttering his name is the scariest thing in a movie full of some of the most cheap, just uninteresting scares that they could have come up with for this character. We go back to the hotel. Everybody's freaking out about leaving. Beverly's like, hey, we are all gonna die if we don't finish him off this cycle. And then they're all like, we can't remember. And Mike, he tells them they're gonna have to remember. Here's where we can finally get our first jump back to the child timeline.
We have to remember.
Remember what?
So from here, the movie of chapter 1 kind of just plays out the way it's supposed to play out. We get our introduction to the child characters, how they come together as a group. We get our first looks at Pennywise. The further you go into the movie without seeing him, that eventual first time actually seeing him instead of just being glimpses like in a storm drain or across a river, it's terrifying to see a horror character in full broad daylight. We eventually make our way to the rock fight, which is where the losers finally all come together for the first time. And as they are walking together, we can easily cut back to the adults who are following the same trail, and it just flows seamlessly. You even have Ben referencing the rock fight.
This is where we came. After the rock fight.
You can cut back to that flashback where they get back from the rock fight and almost continues the scene. Not a fan of the CGI, but that's just the consequences of making it 2 years later. We learn everybody's going to need to get a ritual and fully remember what happens each summer. Mike suggests splitting up. It's going to have to be done all alone. And everybody's like, why are we splitting up? That's not a good idea. We were together that summer. But as we are about to find out, they were not together the entire summer. We jump back to the 4th of July parade. We start learning about the cycle rule with 27 years. The horror starts building up. Bill wants to show the group what he's found. After a brief and excellent jump scare by Pennywise, we make our way to the Neibolt house, which is probably the best sequence in both the movies. After this, group tensions are at an all-time high. Bill and Richie have a falling out. The group splits up. In It Chapter 2, we got an extension of this scene after the fight where Bill and Beverly talk, and then the camera pans over to seamlessly bring us back into the adult timeline. The good thing about this, in both the child timeline and the adult timeline now, the group is split up. So you're starting to see these stories were meant to run organically together. They're complementing the journeys that both the children and the adults are on in a nice way. You're getting nice tidbits of will they, won't they, with Beverly and Bill. Ben in the background still kind of being jealous because by the end of the first movie, we know that Beverly knows that Ben likes her. So whenever we're doing this whole adult thing with will they, won't they with Bill and Beverly, it feels like just we're retreading water whenever it should be focused more on Ben and Beverly. But if you run the stories together, you can do these in both timelines at the same time, and it makes for a better viewing experience because you're not just repeating information that we already know. You're learning it for both at the same time. So from here, we get a few scares for each of the group. They find their tokens. When we finally get to Richie, he's kind of driving through town. He's leaving. He's not going to put up with this anymore. Which, do you blame him? No, but as he's leaving, he's starting to remember more and more of the fun they had. And we can nicely transition back into kids using Chapter 2's flashbacks to go back to when they were split up. We can follow Chapter 1 up to Henry killing his dad, it taking Beverly in her home, and then the group coming together because Beverly's missing and they need to go save her. We find a scene where they're all riding their bikes together to go rescue her. We can nicely transition to a scene of Bill riding his bike around as an adult after he found it in a shop with the shopkeeper played by Stephen King. With the scene of Henry killing his dad, we get introduced to his way more violent tendencies because he's been fully corrupted by it. Bill goes back to the hotel. Eddie's up in his room getting cleaned up. We get a nice mirror of the Henry stabbing his dad, but this time they have a fight that ends with Henry at the library trying to kill Mike. Richie finally finishes him off. Then the group gets a call from Bill who says he's going to finish it off because this kid he's been following throughout Chapter 2 just got utterly demolished. The group is like, where's he going to go? Nowhere else but the Neibolt house, where we can cut nicely back to the kid group going to the same house to finish off it in their timeline. From here, Chapter 1 just finishes out. Reconvene with the adults who have all gone through their similar character arcs as adults, and finally finish off it. bringing the entire story to a close. Now, I have problems with It Chapter 2 that just cannot be fixed. I do not like the entire ending scene with a big CGI, like Pennywise morph spider. Even though saying he's a clown makes sense, it's not a very satisfying conclusion for the group. There's things in the movie that just cannot be fixed. But this edit does significantly improve the viewing experience. On my edit, I've gotten it down to 3 hours and 44 minutes. That is insane considering the original chapter 2 is like 2 hours and 49 minutes. So adding another extra hour and you just get both movies in my opinion, a better viewing experience, at least for the adult timeline. I still like the first movie, but it's nice to see them interwoven and told as one big story because that's what they are. It's the book they were based on. So who knows? Maybe with this TV show coming out, Andy Muschietti will remember, hey, I did say I was going to do a supercut and film more scenes. Hopefully he does that because I would like to see an official one because there's definitely, the groundwork is here. It just needs to be fully realized. And anyways, I hope you enjoyed. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe. I'll catch you in the next one.